Grimdark and its slightly less intense flavors are always popular. People want their gritty, gothic, dark world in which hope is a single candle lit in a chasm of utter darkness. There's a lot of appeal to this vibe, aesthetic, and/or subgenre, depending on how exactly you implement this feeling. And I happen to be quite the connoisseur of dark fantasy, gothic horror, and grimdark, so I hope today to explain a few ideas on how these worlds can be done right, and how the common pitfalls one may find within these may be avoided. We'll structure this in a bit of a classic JBat form today, so we'll get right to that with the very obvious part 1, from dark to grimdark. Naturally, we should start with determining the bounds of what it is that we're talking about. Because, as you've probably already been thinking, grim and dark are just vibes, while actual grim dark is a specific genre, and yet there are tons of other subgenres that fit this discussion. For that reason, I'm not going to make our bounds here super specific. Generally, I'd say if you intend to write something of this sort, with this kind of tone, you already know that's what you're going to do, and you're here watching this video because of that, or maybe you're just interested. But there are 3 metrics we can somewhat measure to at least help determine what makes a story dark, gothic, etc., beyond the whole "it feels that way" sort of thing. Those metrics, at least how I want to define them, are darkness of world, darkness of characters, and darkness of situation. At times, these can all be interlinked and essentially indistinguishable as separate forces, or maybe one or two of them could be active, but not the other ones. And it's really only if you don't have any of these 3 that a story is going to tend to no longer classify as dark, grim, what have you. Fairly often, when you have all 3 of these, you've got something much closer to the orbit of grimdark, though it doesn't have to be grimdark specifically. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream and Warhammer 40k are good examples of this sort of thing, as each of them practice all 3 categories to some extent. Darkness of world is essentially a measure of how the fundamental or near fundamental truths of a world make things generally worse for the average person. For example, if every time you fall asleep, an eldritch god torments you for 8 hours, that's darkness of world. It's a fundamental thing you probably can't change. However, if instead of that, every day an extremely powerful army comes and takes all of your money and food away and repeats the next day, while the situation is arguably materially worse, that's darkness of situation more than world, because that army isn't inherent to the existence of this world. But even if that doesn't explain it perfectly, hopefully my elaboration will help. While obviously darker vibes don't inherently just mean bad things happening to people, it is certainly a part of the calculation. Darkness of world usually applies to things that are outside the control of any one person. There's no single invasion that could be called off, no switch that could be flipped to suddenly make the world not have this aspect to it. Either the fundamental rules of reality make things suck, or the institutions that cause things to suck are so inherent to the existence of the world that removing them isn't really within the bounds of possibility for the story. Darkness of world is one of the few things that is meant to be something that cannot be changed. Or even if it can be changed, it would require something so earth-shakingly powerful as to be considered extremely unlikely. Darkness of world is one of the primary consumers of hope, I guess it could be said. To apply this to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, even should Am not be the antagonist of the story, even should Am suddenly decide that it doesn't want to torture the humans anymore, or simply shut down, our protagonists are still essentially screwed. All of humanity but them has been wiped out. They've been preserved in pained immortality for so long that they're all essentially insane, and even should the world that existed before the disaster that put them in this situation somehow magically return, humanity would still be doomed to extinction. There aren't enough of them for humanity to survive past their individual lives, much less any remaining institutions or anything of that sort to carry on. Even should the plot of the story simply not happen, humanity is still ruined because the state of the world is such that their continued existence is guaranteed to stop. We see this in Warhammer 40k through the lens that even beyond all the galactic scale conflicts that dominate the setting, existence itself is at constant war with the 4 Chaos Gods, which, to oversimplify, because I don't want this to be 3 hours long, are embodiments of everything anathema to life and order. Those who give in and worship these 4 gods then typically go insane and their souls are consumed when they die, and even the very best off amongst their number get promoted to something called a demon prince or princess, which sounds nice until you realize that just makes them a servant for all eternity who just sacrificed a big chunk of their free will. I suppose even more than they already did by serving before that. And even beyond the fundamental truth of the setting, on an institutional level, the combating factions of the setting are so diametrically opposed that there's no chance of everyone sort of working it out and making peace to try to combat the Chaos God's influence. Even the more reasonable factions, if such a term could apply, would still rather wipe one another out and remain in eternal war than actually coexist in some way. The world broad scale of 40k is doomed, especially if you take yet further factors like the theory that the Xenomorph on steroids faction, the Tyranids, have so many reserves that haven't even arrived in the galaxy yet that they're already beyond world-ending power, will just look like a drop in the bucket compared to what's coming. As I said earlier, sometimes darkness of world and darkness of situation can sort of intermesh. 40k is definitely one of those settings, and we'll be talking about that more once we get to Darkness of Setting. But in summary, the world is fundamentally doomed, which can be enough on its own to set the stage for a dark tone, but the next section of horror comes with how characters actually interact. In Eye of No Mouth, the characters represent the grim theme through the way they've all been altered by AM, the massive AI superintelligence that uses them as torture puppets, for lack of a better phrase. Every single one of the remaining humans, save Nimdok, who was a Nazi scientist, were essentially normal people before the situation that they're in was set upon them, but each has deteriorated. Several of them have been physically mutated to look less than human, their behaviors and attitudes have been manipulated, and overall they've been reduced to an almost animalistic state. This particular aspect of grimness in character writing is a slightly newer development in the broad span of literature, being an outgrowth of naturalistic writings, which you can thank Victorian writers for. Naturalism, inspired by the scientific revolution, endeavored to write people often succumbing to this beast-like return to animal state, and thus provided the foundation for a lot of what you'll see with characters being the emphasis of darkness. Though that's obviously not to say that nobody was writing particularly evil people before that, but that particular state of character regression, I suppose you can thank for the Victorians in any case. For a 40k example regarding characters, it's commonly said that there are no good guys in 40k. Institutionally, this is essentially true. Even the ones I'd argue are the closest to almost being decent, the Tau and the Eldar, which are both alien species, have entire graveyards in their closets. The Tau use mind control to keep their subjects in line, and the Eldar will direct hostile forces towards undefended human worlds, just to save a handful of their own from potential danger. And if anybody tells you that the main human faction of 40k, the Imperium, are the good guys, they've probably been getting their lore from YouTube shorts. But what's more important regarding 40k and this aspect is the fact that while a great deal of characters are basically evil, or at least cruel against their enemies, or even their own people, it is the fact that not everyone in 40k is evil that actually sells this aspect better. People end up thinking the Imperium is good because there are several characters in it that are themselves on an individual level pretty decent. Caiaphas Cain, Reboot, Gilliman, and Ivrain generally serve good ends-ish by the setting standards, but even immensely powerful characters cannot change on an institutional level the evils perpetuated across the galaxy, and that's what makes those more heroic characters interesting. They're good in spite of their situation and even in spite of the massive military complex that they're in service of. And we close out this section with the darkness of situation aspect. This is to some extent the least of these darknesses, especially if you're only going to pick one, generally because this definition can become entangled with the concept of stakes. Often the stakes will determine the situation is pretty dark in order to give us a good reason to think that things are going to really suck if the protagonist doesn't win. From a certain angle, even a very noble, bright story like the original trilogy of Star Wars is dark because the Empire blows up planets and enslaves people. So, in the end, what makes the portrayal of these situations actually affect your tone, because this is really all a discussion about tone, in the same way is how closely we see these things portrayed and how much they are meant to personally dig at the audience. Yes, we see Alderaan blow up in Star Wars. We know intellectually that the Empire enslaves people and is evil, but the degree of separation we have from those evils is fairly significant in Star Wars because that's not the tone they were going for. Even with the Death Star and Alderaan's destruction, while it's still a massive-scale crime, it is in some ways clean. It's one shot, the planet explodes into dust, we don't see any actual people nor hear their reactions, their terror, or anything like that. And other than Kenobi's line about the voices calling out and suddenly being silenced, there really isn't too much. It's why in a setting like 40K, they decided that sort of thing wasn't quite good enough, and so the virus bomb is a thing in 40K, in which instead of simply exploding a planet, which they also do sometimes, they can instead bombard it with biotoxins that cause everything on said planet to die a brutal, wasting death. While plenty of stories describe, show, or at least imply characters getting, say, eaten by monsters, the tone of someone getting eaten by a monster can vary a lot. From the Jurassic Park toilet eating scene to whatever the hell this thing is that I'm about to put on the screen. Which, before it's put on the screen, I'll warn you, just don't look at it if you don't want to read a more thoroughly described process of getting eaten by bug monsters. So if you don't want to see that, just look away from the screen for a couple seconds. With the darkness of situation, it is thus often not about the situation itself, but the way it's described. A peaceful moonlit night can become a haunted, screaming void of blackness, filled with the primal fear of what lurks in the woods, dependent entirely on context and the way in which you go about your set dressing. The same Tyranids that did the thing in that image that was just shown are not at all terrifying in Space Marine 2, because in that game you're operating from the perspective of a giant walking tank of a soldier who mows them down by the dozen. Sometimes, of course, the horror can just be inherent to the situation, which is what we see in I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream, because no matter how you spin it, so long as you keep the fundamentals of that situation intact, there's no easy way to describe the scenario we find the characters of that story in without indicating the implicit horror of everything. There is no accurate G-rated way to say that the last half-dozen odd people have been permanently enslaved by an AI intelligence that intends to torture and deprive them of sustenance for the rest of time. The most you can say without making that disturbing is to say that a computer is keeping a couple people as less than voluntary friends. And even then, obviously, you still kind of know that that's a bad thing. It would be very difficult, though probably not impossible, to portray that situation as being anything other than inherently disturbing. Even if you filtered it through a character's delusions to make it seem pleasant in some way or not that bad, if anything, that would only make it worse because the audience would pick up on the fact that the character has basically either been deluded or Stockholm Syndrome to the point of no longer caring. With all this established, these being the three levers we'll be pulling to adjust our tone, we can move on to part 2. Grimdark, not Grimderp. If you haven't heard that latter term before, it is often used to describe when settings like this, most often applied to Warhammer 40k, get so over the top with their endless, miserable drudgery that it ends up looping around to being almost comical. If I tell you malnourished factory worker 54,248,167 works 140-hour work weeks for every day of his life, and inhabits a 3-square-meter pod with a bed made of concrete, and he eats gruel made of other ground-up people, and he's kind of tall, so he also doesn't really fit in that pod, and on and on and on and on and on. Eventually, it just loops back around to being silly because it becomes abundantly clear how impossible that sort of situation would be, and how unwilling the factory worker character would be to do essentially anything. While obviously darker stories can suffer from any of the same problems that other stories can, this one problem tends to be particularly bespoke to settings with darker tones, as they can create situations like the above, in which the writer tries so hard to be edgy and create darkness and misery that it sort of careens over the cliff of suspension of disbelief into self-parody. None of this is to say that there is some arbitrary limit on the degree of suffering or horror you can place within a story. There's not a meter that fills up or a rate per page that suddenly makes it stop working. It is instead almost entirely caught up in the audience's ability to be aware of why exactly you, the author, are making decisions the way that you are to portray this thing. Grimderp happens when the audience reads a scene and is consciously aware of the fact that it only exists the way that it does because the author was trying to force the effect of being disturbed upon the audience, as opposed to trying to achieve some other effect alongside that. And that's because, of course, using these themes in horrible situations can be used for a variety of different purposes that make them completely worthwhile. As I was talking about earlier, 40K, while being a setting that definitely trends into Grimderp at times due to its plethora of different writers, also has some that handle the aspect of the setting really well, who use the darkness to make the more triumphant or hopeful moments shine through, or to build up the stakes such that a character's final defiance of whatever evil they're facing, even should they be defeated in the end, stands out in that classic rage against the dying of the light kind of way that these darker tone stories really excel at. Success is all about the execution. If the suffering your protagonist goes through is for a specific reason, if it's to be analogous to some real-world evil, if it's to break them down so that the following act can build them back up, if it's to starkly contrast the situation of another character, those are all reasons to introduce these bleak situations. But you need to be consistent and you need to be conscientious of what the audience will be thinking when they read these things, or watch them or play them or what have you. Regarding consistency, though, the gauge of where specifically in your story the line between dark and derp will be crossed is set the first time that you show the audience something that is intended to disturb them. You can often get away with quite a lot the first time around. Even should the beginning be peaceful, tranquil, and inoffensive, we as the audience would expect, especially if we knew the genre that your piece is in, that something is going to change to make the situation deteriorate. A good example to work with for this might be in Kingdom Come Deliverance. You get, depending on how much time you spend looking around the initial village, something like 30 minutes to an hour of just living your life as a blacksmith's son. You get to meet some of your friends and neighbors, meet the girl that your character is sweet with, and generally get a feeling for the town of Silver Skallets. Then it gets burned down and pillaged by the invading humans. Your parents are murdered in front of your eyes, you can find your sweetheart dead, and you have to flee to deliver the news of what happened to a nearby stronghold. The tone is set right away. Kingdom Come Deliverance is going to be depicting the brutality of medieval combat and is not going to pull punches. It's going to show the era's warfare for all its ugliness. So by the time of the second game, which if you don't know starts maybe a literal day or two after the first ends, it is a direct continuation, we get to experience a medieval torture scene, which of course is great fun, except for the fact that we're on the receiving end. Yet we don't quite get to the whole split you in half chair or a quartering or anything of quite that nature. Kingdom Come Deliverance's brutality isn't centered on blood and gore, but more so authentically depicting human cruelties and the way that these people end up dying, for seemingly pointless reasons or through betrayal or just for the sake of wanton violence or what have you. So if our character got literally pulled apart by 4 horses during a quartering and we watched it in all its grotesquerie, it actually probably would be a little bit much for the game as it is. It might veer a bit into Grimdark, into shock value. Even the torture scene we do get, where we're beaten up pretty bad, would be extremely out of place in any of the Legend of Zelda games. Depending on how bad your sense of humor is, mine is dumber, I assure you, the mere concept of something like that in a Zelda game is so stupid it actually becomes funny, and thus Grimderp. It'd be like if when the droids in Jabba's palace get hot irons pressed onto their feet, we were meant to take that seriously instead of as a sort of funny gag in the background. This can all be wrapped up as a factor of tonal consistency. Tone is a more slightly nebulous term than some of the others one works with in fiction, but it's just as important as anything else. And while you can bend tone, while it can change over time, it's sort of like a pasta noodle. It needs heat, water, and time to be able to bend. If you try and bend it when it's dry, it's just going to snap. And now we can address our final portion, part 3, who does it right and how. While I'd say I have no mouth and 40k generally do it well, I've been talking about them all video, so I'm going to give us some new examples. One game that I think is a stunning example of tone done right is Darkest Dungeon. While I think both games are phenomenal, I think the first in particular manages its tone perfectly. You can see it in every aspect of the fiber of the setting, even if this is your first time looking at anything to do with the game. You can already tell exactly what the tone is going to be like, and it's maintained well throughout the game. All the heroes you use to explore these dungeons are in some ways facades. In not one of them can you see their eyes, and a good many of them are helmeted. It sort of leads you to understand that makes them almost expendable. There are always new heroes waiting for you at the carriage, ready to be thrown into the fray. And yet, they're very human in every sense of the word, even despite their interchangeability. They quarrel, they befriend one another, they get stressed, and when confronted with the unfathomable horrors of the Darkest Dungeon, they can break. And yet, they can also stand tall. They speak of hope, the light, the chances of making a brighter future. When some might break, others will remain resolute. Though the situation in Darkest Dungeon is undeniably bleak, there still remains that spark of hope that everything can be made right if only you fight hard enough for it. Vermintide might be yet another example. Though it's set in a setting of the Warhammer Fantasy universe, literally just called the End Times, and you can guess how that goes, it manages to do its tone perfectly. You might expect such a game would have the most miserable, pessimistic, hopeless bags of sadness you've ever seen, and yet I'd argue it's got some of the best characters in any cooperative game I've played. While the very essence of the environments you encounter drip with horror, your weapons are dark and damaged, scratched up and imperfectly made. Though you encounter the corpses of the countless innocents and soldiers alike slaughtered by your innumerable enemies, though you face countless foes, the Ubersreich 5 fights on. You've got Kruber, the veteran soldier archetype who just got dragged into this, Saltspire, the fanatic who's out to slay every last one of the Ratmen, Barden, the jolly but secretly very depressed dwarf, Carillion, the aloof yet witty elf, and Sienna, the group mom who's just a little bit too unstable and throws fireballs at people. Each of these characters is just so well done. Saltspire, especially for his iconic Sigmar-fearing voice, is still my profile picture on Steam, and he has been for years, because he's just such a fun character. I mean, if you want to see darker settings done well in everything from visuals to character writing to audio design even, just play a bit of Darkest Dungeon or Vermintide 2. They're on everything that could probably run on a potato. They're probably on sale when this video comes out. But I've glazed those games many times before, and I will continue to do so in the future. But that, I think, will conclude our video about writing dark settings. There's always more to say about any topic I make a video on, especially since we're trying to quantify writing what is essentially just a vibe most of the time, but hopefully something in here has been useful. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to hang around, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don Sadako, and Cavalier of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion, Jodion Void, and Razor the Arcader, our knights, and Greer, TOW, and Craig, our loyal squires. And remember, where there is light, there is hope.